If you're interested in learning how we built this amazing deck patio, keep on watching. Let's get started. In my last video, I showed the entire process on how to frame a low profile deck just like this. But in this video, we're going to show the entire process of how to properly install decking. And in this case, we're using composite decking by Timbertech. It's actually a PVC product, and the color itself is Castlegate, the Landmark Collection, if you're interested. Each one of these boards comes a little over 20 feet long, and that's a good thing because we're cutting it very close because our deck in this circumstance is 21 feet long. We are doing a picture frame deck, which does provide an extremely beautiful look in the end, but that also accounts for that extra foot of length. This means we should have very little waste, which is a good thing because these boards are extremely expensive and we want as little waste as possible. The first order of business when installing a picture frame deck is to get that first mitered corner perfectly positioned. I set my mitered angle at 45 degrees and I cut that as straight as I possibly can. The first cut I showed was actually cutting off the vast majority of the excess that I didn't need, but I did cut it about 2 inches long, and once I had my 45 degree mark, I cut the remainder. Our framing on this deck is 14 feet long, but I do cut this piece 14 feet and a half inch because we do have to count for the fascia board that's going to be placed on the front vertical locations of our deck patio. In a perfect world, we would be able to fit this board right underneath our slider, but in this circumstance, since we are dealing with a concrete step, we had to butt it up against our slider, and to make sure that we have a nice seam across the siding of our house, we had to notch it out accordingly. Once I laid the board into position and I make sure that it's a nice snug fit exactly where I want it, I make a line all the way across, noting where I want the adhesive to stop. For adhesive, I did try an exterior construction adhesive that was specifically formulated to work with concrete and PVC, but in this circumstance, that did not hold up. So the one that did hold up was the Liquid Nail Fuse-It Max. I didn't get a lot of film with that one because it was a fix at a later portion in the video, but just know that that one did hold up and work so far. If it doesn't, I will make sure and note that in the description box below. The fasteners that I'm installing on this project are one of my favorite fasteners of all time. They're called Cortex fasteners, and you'll be seeing plenty of them within this video because I have to install over 1,000 of these fasteners on this 14 by 21 foot deck. As I just noted, this deck is 21 feet long, and it had to be that long because of where our existing concrete patio was. The only problem with that is that these boards only come 20 feet long, and therefore to make sure that we not only have a perfect mitered corner, but we also are not wasting more material, I cut a small mitered piece of decking and fit that right next to our mitered corner. This provides the best of both worlds because it not only creates a beautiful looking corner, but it also salvages material so we don't have to cut an extra board. Once I had one corner solidified, I then made my way down to the opposite side, making sure that I still had that half-inch space in it. And in all honesty, if I did this over again, I'd probably give myself at least 3/4 of space for that fascia board, even though the fascia board is only a half-inch thick, because that would account for variances within our framing, and there were some variances on this project. These Cortex fasteners provide two very distinct things. Number one, it provides you with the best hold strength possible because you're going through the dead center of the board. And two, this system comes with perfectly matched plugs to plug every single fastener. It's not going to be the fastest install, but it certainly will be one of the best looking once our plugs are installed. Now that we have our first mitered corner taken care of, the installation process really speeds up because we're working off of that existing corner, which should be perfectly square. When installing, I always suggest cutting off the factory edge because you can't guarantee that the edge that comes from the factory is perfectly square. When I'm using my speed square, I can basically guarantee that that cut is going to be straight and even all the way down this line. Also note that it's a lot easier to make these cuts with a circular saw than it is a chop saw because these boards are 20 feet long and it's very difficult to wield these things into position to guarantee that you have a perfect cut on your chop saw. On the skill saw, you can basically just let the board rest wherever it lies and make sure that it's lined up appropriately with your speed square. The small orange devices that are in between each deck board are obviously deck spacers, and the ones that I'm using on this project are specifically called out as Wise Guides by a company called Deck Wise. If you want them, I'll make sure and leave a link in the description box below on where you can purchase those or any of the other tools or materials seen in this video. As I make my way to our first concrete step, I apply our construction adhesive, but I apply it in strips, not going across the concrete, because our concrete is slightly slanted at this location, and therefore any moisture that gets behind here, I want to make sure is able to drain properly. I'm applying screws wherever I can, and I don't really have any issues with expansion contraction at this location because there's such a small amount of concrete that has to be accounted for on every single board. You may want to add a bit of weight at this location if need be, but because our fasteners were so close to the end of this board, then we really didn't need to apply any weight to them. More of a precaution in this circumstance. If you are wondering why our deck boards are actually wet, it's not because it rained, it's actually been quite hot in the Seattle the last couple days, it's because we've been watering our deck. So if you're wondering why I'm actually spraying down the decking, it's not because it's trying to stay hydrated. It's because of the spacing. See our beautiful spacing over here? Well, it was cool when I was installing it, as well as I had the canopy overhead when I was installing this section. So the spacing should stay quite consistent and perfect all the way down. If you try and install it when it's super hot out, and you don't have it covered or you're not spraying it down, then there could be potential for the spacing to gap out significantly if you don't account for that ahead of time. So keep that in mind if you're installing it, and make sure you water your deck. The term gapping out might not be the most professional term, but it's the one that really resonates with me because if you install these boards in the dead of summer when it's super hot out, that means the board is actually becoming longer, and therefore once you install and it cools down, it will shrink on you. So your 1/4 inch space might all of a sudden turn into a 1/2 inch space in between the boards, and that's the last thing you want when you want a perfect seam all the way down. Now that I've made my way to the last rung of this deck project, I apply my construction adhesive in the same manner that I did previously, making sure that it's not one fluid bead so moisture can drain properly. As I install these final couple of boards, I do realize that the last board isn't going to be one fluid piece, and that's fine because I did account for that, but in my personal perspective, the last board just needs to be greater than 1/2 of the thickness of a single board. This last board that I'm cutting down to size is approximately 3 1/4 inches thick, and I'm using my table saw with a feather board to get it exactly the thickness that I want all the way down. Now, in all honesty, this probably might have been a little bit easier with a circular saw, but I had my table saw and a feather board, so I figured that was going to be a little bit easier. It was not easy to handle a 20-foot long board by yourself, so if you do have a table saw, just try and make sure you have a second person on hand to help you. After I had all my deck boards fully installed, I did realize that I wanted to give a little bit more extra support for that very first picture frame board that I installed at the very beginning. In order to get through the concrete with ease, I had to use a carbide drill bit, which made quick work of the drilling process. Just make sure you have a vacuum on hand to suck up all the dust particles. I apply a piece of painter's tape right over our hole and fill it up as much as possible with our liquid nails construction adhesive. With the tape down, cleanup is extremely quick, and we're still using our Cortex fasteners for that fasten location because I want to guarantee that we're still able to use the plugs that come with the kit. We still have to install our final picture frame board, and in order to provide a perfect seam all the way down this line, I take my chalk line and snap a line exactly where it needs to be placed. If you're a surgeon with your circular saw, you can do this by hand, but I certainly want a guide because I want to guarantee that this line is perfectly straight. That's why I take a piece of the fascia board, which I know is very straight, and use that as a guide for a circular saw. I preset the depth of our circular saw, making sure that it's just slightly above the thickness of our deck board so I'm not cutting into our membrane below. I'm not cutting the first board that I installed because that coincides nicely with our picture frame deck, but all the other boards need a slight trim, and as you can see, it is quite a slight trim. This is how much waste we have on these deck boards, and that's truly remarkable because, like I said previously, these deck boards are not cheap, and we don't have very little waste, which is exactly what I wanted on this project. As for cleanup, I used a utility blade to cut off any of the slight edges that didn't come off naturally when bending them off. The first and last deck boards that I had to cut do have to be cut with a multi-tool because there's obviously a circular cut at this location because I was using a circular saw and I didn't want to go too far into the next board. Very easy to do as long as you take your time. Now we can fit our final deck board into place and make sure that it's just a little bit long and overhanging so it matches up perfectly with the picture frame board beside it. Occasionally you will misscrew a whole location, so if this does happen, I will show you later on in the video how I fix it with a cap, but just know that it is very fixable if you misplace a screw. With these picture frame deck boards, I do generally install every 6 inches versus every 12 inches, just to guarantee that we have plenty of structural support and they're not going to be moving on us over time. Probably overkill, but might as well do it just in case. Once we have our final deck board fully screwed down, I can finally make my way to our fascia board. The fascia boards come approximately 12 inches wide, but I run it through the table saw and cut them perfectly in half. Once perfectly in half, I then miter one corner and then cut the other side to length. It's ready to be installed as long as you have construction adhesive applied to your joists, and lining up the miter of your fascia board with the miter above it on your deck is pretty straightforward, but the key element here that I suggest is to actually cut one miter at 45 degrees and the other miter at 46 degrees. That might not seem like a lot, but because you're never going to see that inside corner of the miter again, that means it's going to be a lot easier to nail down that very finite miter corner with your fascia board. Keep that in mind on your installation. I secure screws every 12 inches on the fascia boards, and once those are installed, we can get to more fasteners. Yep, we're not done because I skipped every other bay of installing our screws because it's a lot easier to come back around, snap a chalk line, and have a perfect line for your screws to be applied to. That not only guarantees that the line of your screws is perfectly straight, but it's a lot faster to install all these screws than we did previously. Also know that the chalk line that you're using is not going to be staining the deck. It is chalk and you can easily just wipe it off with a rag or hose it off with a hose. Now when I say fast, this method is fast compared to the previous version, but it still takes quite a bit of time. I installed all of these bays as well as capped off this entire deck, but that still took me almost a full day to do. Keep that in mind on your project because it will be time consuming. But now that we have all of our fasteners fully installed, let's get to plugs. These plugs perfectly match our decking because they come straight from Timbertech. The other really nice thing about these plugs is that it comes in a strip, and therefore installing these are actually much faster because you can align the strip accordingly with all the other fasteners. The one thing you really do need to think about when installing is the grain direction, because this decking does have grain direction, and in order to guarantee that your plugs are as seamless as possible, you want to make sure you have the proper grain direction. If you see me moving this white strip one direction or the other, that's because the grain has to go a certain direction in order to have as seamless of a look as possible. In a perfect world, all these plugs would be positioned exactly how I need them every single time, but there are slight variances that I have to account for when installing these plugs. This is also a perfect time to remind you to get a very good quality pair of knee pads. If you don't, your knees will be killing you after a day like today, but because I have a really nice pair, my knees felt way better than I personally even thought they would after a day like today. If you do have an area where you have to repair a hole that you weren't able to get a screw through, just use a drill bit and then install your cap. A very easy, quick, and simple way to tackle the holes that were just misplaced screws during the installation process. And finally, our fascia board plugs. Now I did leave some of these screws out just slightly during the drying curing process of the adhesive, but once that adhesive is fully dried, I then sucked those screws back into the board and I can then insert all of our plugs. But guess what? Now that we have all of our plugs fully installed, we are done. absolutely love how this entire deck patio turned out. It's so extremely solid and feels like it's been here ever since the house has. If you're interested in building this yourself and want some free digital plans, then make sure you sign up for my email list, and there's going to be a link in the description box below. I'm going to have it available for free for anyone on my email list for 24 hours, but then it's going to go straight to my Etsy page for purchase. But no matter whether you're going to build this deck or not, it's still one truly beautiful, sexy beast. Oh yeah,